have another set of Africa powerhouses on this panel from two different sectors. One from the more diplomatic engagement side and one from the business side. But combined, they have, I don't know how many years of experience, I won't even guess.
Ms. Nima, I've been looking at this for about 3 years.
So I'm guessing that in this audience, they need little introduction, so I will keep introductions short. But we have Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, who is former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. She's currently a senior counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group. She has a long and very distinguished career in the diplomatic service. She is a real star. She has focused on peace and security, democracy and government, economic empowerment, investment opportunities in Africa. She also served as Director General of the Foreign Service and Director of Human Resources, where she oversaw all personnel functions from of the Department of State. She is also a associate at Georgetown University. So I'm, it's probably a real treat for the students there as well. Next, we have Dr. Mima Nedeljkovic, President Emeritus and Senior Advisor of the Initiative for Global Development, a nonprofit organization that engages corporate leaders to reduce poverty through business growth and investment in Africa. He was previously the IGD President and CEO. I'm not going to go into his biography because it's very long, but he's had decades of experience all over the African continent working on business and investment, and we are so delighted to have both of you here. I'm going to turn to you for perhaps 8-10 minutes each to talk a little bit about where you see Africa policy going, where the gaps might be, where the opportunities are, and maybe if you could, a little bit of reflection on what is important to me at this moment is how do you galvanize kind of support for engaged Africa policy. The business sector is one part, but I think reaching a broader public on the importance of Africa is equally important. Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, you begin. You can speak from here or for the podium.
Oh, no, I prefer to speak from here. I don't have an address to deliver. These are sort of random thoughts that I jotted down as I thought about what we would do. And I think what will make this discussion most interesting is to have a dialogue with all of you and hear what you would like to discuss. I was asked to talk about opportunities and challenges and make some recommendations for U.S. Africa policy. And having worked on African issues and on the African continent for more than 35 years, I've seen a lot of changes on the continent, and I've seen a lot of changes in our own policy. Right now, we're clearly at a crossroads for U.S. policy, but we're at a crossroads for the continent of Africa as well. It's a bellwether moment for the continent. That I think will define our relationship, the U.S. relationship with Africa for the coming decades, but it will also define how Africa adjusts and moves forward over the next couple of decades. The new relationship that we will have with Africa will determine how the continent defines itself in the future. And that's something we're watching very, very closely. I've broken this down into 3 areas I'd like to talk about. And I know Mima is going to touch on trade and investment, but I'll talk briefly about the trade and investment opportunities. Second, about democracy and governance, and where I see things on the democracy and governance front on the continent. And then lastly, I would like to talk about what we can expect, what I see we can expect from the new administration as we move forward, and finally some recommendations for how we can impact policy in the future. First, on the trade and investment side, I think for me, the president of Ghana, when he came here early in the year, he defined a new approach for how at least Ghana would deal with trade and with investment. And I thought it was extraordinary that he stayed in the Washington area for a week, engaging with the private sector, engaging with the community of people interested in Africa, and no substantive administration meetings. And some of the things I've said to other African leaders is that is the approach that you need to take. Yes, those substantive meetings are important if you get them, but don't sit back and wait for the substantive meetings to happen. Define your own priorities, and I think Akufo-Addo really took that and moved it forward. I didn't give him that advice, but I certainly appreciated the approach that he took, and it's an approach that I've recommended to other leaders as well, who are waiting to be anointed and waiting to be embraced, waiting for their moment in the sun when they get a White House visit, and they're losing the opportunity to push their trade and investment agenda. President Akufo-Addo said he wanted trade over aid. He thought it was time that African countries, in particular Ghana, move away from his message that they move away from trade and move away from aid and look at trade and investment as the opportunity for countries to move forward. It's going to be trade and investment that will create jobs. It's going to be investments in infrastructure that will attract new businesses. Aid is, in his view, a thing of the past. I'm not saying that aid, and I'm not talking about you, Greg, but I think countries have come to understand that aid cannot be their only mode to progress. They have to combine that with a much more directed effort at encouraging investments in their economies, building their economies, and coming up with a strategy that will create jobs that come from within. Secondly, I think as we watch how Africans are moving forward on the Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think that is going to see some changes in the approaches that African countries make as they deal with us in the future. We've had 11 countries sign on. That's 50% of what's needed. So they still need an 11 more. And we're all watching that space very, very closely to see how countries move forward on this. And I think, again, if they move that agenda forward, we are going to see a different approach. Because while we constantly talk about Africa, the continent, like it's a country, when these 54 countries come together in a free trade agreement, if it works the way it's supposed to work, it could have a major impact on the continent as it moves forward. Secondly, I want to touch on democracy and governance. This has always been a high priority for our administrations, regardless of party. We have worked to encourage good governance. We've worked to encourage elections that are free and fair and transparent. We have pushed governments on the issues of human rights and press freedoms and basically taking care of their people. And we've pushed them on the issue of corruption and the detrimental impact that corruption has on their economies. Now, we have some good news stories coming out of Africa. I think what is happening in Ethiopia is extraordinary. We don't know. I talked to the taxi drivers, and I was in Minnesota last week, and I had an Ethiopian taxi driver, and I'm like, what is this that's going on in Ethiopia? And I've yet to meet an Ethiopian who thinks this is bad. And if somebody thinks it's bad, I'd love to hear what your thinking is. But so I'm talking to the taxi driver, and I said, "What is going on? And where did this guy come from?" And he said, "He came from God.
Yes.
God sent him. God sent him to us." But it's a reflection again of how changes have taken place, sort of under the radar. Because I don't think any of us saw this coming in Ethiopia. We all hoped that it would come. We were pressing for these changes to be made, but none of us saw the handwriting on the wall. So Ethiopia is an extraordinarily good news story. I think Angola, on the democracy and governance front, is another good news story. And I think Angola is an example of what happens when an old leader chooses their successor. Power is empowering. So the fact of choosing a successor does not mean that person will be controlled by the person who chose them. And we've seen that happen over and over again on the continent, usually in a bad way, but this one has happened in a good way. And I think this is extraordinarily significant. We're looking at elections in Africa, and we've had some good ones. I still stand by that the election in Nigeria in 2015 was one of the best ever across the continent. Ghana's election in 2017. Gambia's dropped the marbles into a bucket in front of everybody. Even that election turned out okay. Liberia's election, replacing Sirleaf. Again, a good election. I will say, for the record, that a good election does not always mean the election of a good president. And I'm not naming any names, but I think it says to others in Africa, but also to us, that Africans have bought into the concept of democracy and the concept of elections. Now, are they perfect elections? No. I met with President Kabila in New York in September, and he said the elections in DRC were going to be perfect. And I told him that worried me because I'd never seen the perfect election. And so we might be waiting if we see a perfect election. But we have seen some good elections on the continent of Africa. And again, I think the broad feeling across the continent, and Afrobarometer did a survey, I think back in 2015, that said Africans want democracy. They appreciate elections. And while the elections, as I said, some of them are not great, look at what we're dealing with here in the United States right now. I was asked to give a speech a few weeks ago on South Africa's fragile democracy. And I told the group I didn't buy into the idea that South Africa's democracy was fragile. I thought South Africa's democracy was evolving. And we're still evolving in our own country. In 24 years, we can expect that we are going to see some peaks and valleys in countries like South Africa and around the continent as they grapple with what democracy will mean to them in the future. There's some upcoming elections that we're watching very closely coming up. DRC, December 23rd. And again, I don't think we're going to see perfection. I worry that we're going to see much less. But the fact of the election is a good thing. The fact that Kabila handpicked his replacement says that he hopefully plans to step aside. I'm a glass half full, coffee cup half full kind of person, and rising. The fact of the election, for me, says a lot. There are some issues, in terms of the participation of the opposition, in terms of the electoral polls, in terms of the voting machines that I'm told are not voting machines, but are ballot machines. All of those raise questions. But we have made a step forward. There, I think, will be an election on December 23rd. Nigeria's election in February of next year, South Africa's election early next year as well, are elections that we will be watching very closely. But we've also seen some backsliding on the continent of Africa. And Ambassador Mulamula, Tanzania is at the top of that list for me. You can't say that, but I can. I'm worried about the trends that we are seeing taking place in Tanzania right now. Uganda, I worry about what we see happening in Uganda. I'm still hopeful, though, that we will see a turnaround in those areas. So how will the U.S. respond to these changes that are taking place on the continent of Africa? I think that question is still an open one. We're all looking forward to seeing, to the launch of the New Africa strategy that I know the administration has been working on. That's a good sign. The fact that the strategy is being worked on and that at some point we're going to see that strategy. I'm hoping that one of the things that we see in the strategy is what we've seen in every administration in the past, is that they continue to do the good things that the previous administration did. They continue with the initiatives such as YALI and Power Africa and the Malaria Initiative and PEPFAR, and those things that have been successful, MCC, that they continue to move and improve on those initiatives, and hopefully will come up with some new initiatives of their own. We still, on the bright side, I think we still have bipartisan support for the continent, and we should hopefully continue to encourage that. And finally, in terms of recommendations, I think everything that I've said and what we've talked about today point to the importance of the diaspora community. It points to the importance of the constituency for Africa and the targeted advocacy that is needed to help this administration, to help our new members of Congress define their positions on Africa. I find that one of the things I am regularly doing outside of government now is going on the Hill to give briefings on Africa. There is an interest there, and we need to help define what that interest will look like in terms of policy. And work with our members of Congress to ensure that they have a policy that's focused on Africa. And even if they're not personally interested themselves, when Congresswomen like Representative Bass puts forward legislation, then she has the support of other members of Congress because they've been informed by their constituents, informed by the diaspora, how they should approach policies on Africa. So I will end there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, and many thanks to Dean Brigady, GW, Jennifer for asking me coming in, Mel, of course, for CFA. I think there's just as an intro, kind of sweet irony here. I'm also a alumni, I'm a foreigner too, alumni of George Washington University and the Elliott School.
Wow.
But ironically, it was a Sino-Soviet student. For those of you that know, I'm originally from the old Yugoslavia, Serbia today, but then went on to Ethiopia. I grew up in Ethiopia the first 10 years of my life. Kapramariam, that's why I speak French, the French lycée. But the interesting part is finishing an MA in Sino-Soviet Institute in 76. There was no other choice but basically the Intel. There was no business. So I said, no, that's not going to work. So I went back to my other roots. So I'm a double diaspora. I'm Serbo-Ethiopian American. Speaking of diaspora squared. So when this opportunity came, I said, it's a really sweet opportunity. So let me come to that. And I want to give sort of the business spin. Was introduced as President Emeritus. I always thought that only came once you died. But anyway, I'm a living President Emeritus. YGD rolled out in August. We transitioned Leila Ndiaye, came on as CEO and president, and I went back to what I know best, which is business. That's been spent really all my life, somewhere or another in the continent. I lived in Abidjan 9 years, many of those 5 years as USCD, the African Development Bank. What has happened clearly is a massive, drastic transition of what's happening on the continent. The business sector really is real. The homegrown business sector is real. They're the real partners. So if I look at it from the standpoint of, as set up here, opportunities, challenges, and recommendations, and again, I'll speak straight business. My companies, people know Schaefer Group out of Louisiana, Africa Global. I'm on banks right now, Vista Bank, that's been acquired in 3 countries. It used to be Fee Bank, First International Bank. We bought it with Lilium Capital in New York. Again, diaspora, actually the chairman, Simon Tiamtore, is a Burkinabe American, tied up with a Yugo Ethiopian American now. We're acquiring banks, very important, because that's really how US business come in when you put in US banks on the continent. But how do we, I mean, opportunities are endless. I'm just coming, so if I start wondering, I'm just off a very long flight from Joburg through Addis on ET. There was the African Investor Forum that the ADB hosted in Johannesburg and Sandton. You want to see if there's business opportunities, all you had to do was attend that. Over 1,000 people, literally the fire marshal had to close it down because they had registrations and that they could not handle any more people. So the opportunities, there's no question about, across sectors. The key is, how do you make them a reality? You know, you hear this sort of slogans of Africa rising, Africa sinking, Africa going sideways. You know, for me, it's all of the above. But what is important is that more and more of the countries are in fact rising. The opportunities are rising. The regression path is positive in that sense. That's the important thing. So I think even while the Continental Free Trade Agreement, let's see it come into place, in the meantime, I still tell my business colleagues, choose your markets. It's still, whether you like it or not, very much country-based markets, and I'll come back to the scaling problem that comes out of that. The other sort of reality is, how do we, and Congresswoman Bass referred to it, how do we really get the American SMEs and diaspora involved in the business side? You know, that's really where I think is a big and important issue of doing so on the opportunity side, getting that out. And I'll come to that in a second. We have then our tools, if you will, the sort of U.S. government tools out there, whether it's USAID, the new U.S., I think they're dropping the I think they're called U.S. DFC. I actually got some sort of advisory roundtable there this afternoon. They're trying to figure out where to go with this new authorities. Whether their answer to China or not, I don't know, but at least it's a start to an answer. Of course, the AGOA, Electrify Power Africa, the U.S. Embassy, you name it. I mean, these are all the various sort of tools. There's one big tool still missing, the Exim Bank. Whether or not that comes back to where it should be, I don't know. But interestingly enough, with the maturation of the business sector and the financing tools on the continent itself, I can speak personally, we basically then go to the African Export-Import Bank and really, to some extent, get the same sort of service and ability to be able to get trade finance with another entity. So it's really, how do you go about making the reality? So the small companies, you have to either ride on the back of big companies or ride and leverage off of U.S. government programs, whether that's USAID, you know, African Development Bank finance projects, or U.S., you know, whatever the FDC is going to be producing out there. I think that is the most important way. That's the only way. Otherwise, it's just too simply expensive to be able to kind of establish the beachhead. The flip side of that is, choose the beachheads. It's 54, 55 countries. I keep, depending how you want to count it. You can't be in all of those. I know myself now, I've stepped back out in business. Okay, here's kind of West Africa as my region. These are, you know, the 4 or 5 countries we really know, because you have to be there regularly. If you're not, very difficult to continue the business. The other way is partnerships. Partnerships with U.S. companies and partnerships with what are now very mature, developed African businesses. That is really where you want to look for the partnership. And who are some of those folks out there? I chuckle with people because there's something I call the U.S. Mafia running about, Fulbright scholars. There are many become ministers. There's an advantage in dealing with that. If you go about in every country, you're going to find some key people who've had the U.S. education, and more. Now, from a policy standpoint, I know we have fewer of those because that's been cutting back. That may be one recommendation in terms of being able to get better sort of access and relationships on the continent. On sectors, and I just want to keep brief so we have the discussion here. Of course, I'm biased agro-industry, but I think we have an awful lot to give in the agro-industry. And think of it, it's agro-industry. That's not agriculture. You're not going to go around the other side of the world necessarily to plant. But what is the advantage that we have? It's the process. It's milling. It's what Schaefer does in sugar, rice industry. It's been pulping, power, cogen. I have a pleasure. I should have actually at the very beginning said my real reason I'm here, I wanted to be with Linda Thomas Greenfield because she was ambassador in Liberia when we first went in with Buchanan Renewables, and soon after President Sirleaf became president. And we're the first non-military machinery brought in, a lot of heavy agriculture machinery, harvesting machinery for wood. But if I can use actually that as a case, very interesting in terms of the importance of also the relationships there. We went and had an issue where chipping, the whole thing was how to renew the rubber industry in Liberia. Well, as I said, President, it's easy. We take out the old trees and put in the new trees. What do we do with the old trees? Then we backed up into chipping and then shipping that to Europe as a fuel to mix with wood to meet some of the targets for CO2 because you replant the trees and get the credits. Then we started discussing putting the power station in Liberia. Got the concession, ironically, unfortunately, never got through to the PPA. My back collapsed with partially an accident in Africa a long time ago, and the Liberian roads did me in. And when the relationship got lost and the European sides came in, and I'm not speaking necessarily, for me and my magic, I'm speaking from the standpoint of the importance of relationships, the whole thing started disintegrating. So one needs to really understand how the deal is structured, who the people are, and keep a strong relationship with both the policymakers in countries and the African business sector that I'm telling you is very, very strong, very powerful now. Now, what are the Africans looking for? There's another thing it's important to know. It's no longer just, let me sell you the goods and services. That might be fine if it's a finance thing through USAID or MCC or whatever USDFC ends up being. What they're looking for is partnerships. But it's growth. It's growth through the investments with the partners that's going to require then that machinery and the services. So if you want to be, tell John Deere, AGCO, Matthew Ferguson, any of these people, you're not going to just sell your tractors. What you're going to be doing is helping grow the agro-industry, the African partners that are with American companies, creating the industry, the larger farms that need your machinery. Then you're going to sell your machinery. So I think that's really the difference between the 90s, 2000, where we are today in 2018. Partnerships in the real sense, that's what people are looking for. Challenges, and sorry, the other very quickly sectors, clearly power, infrastructure, logistics. Right on the back of MCC, I sit on the advisory council that we just a little while ago approved $540 million to Cote d'Ivoire for a port facility. But it's not port, it's really logistics of the port. It's all trucking logistics interface. Who is stronger in logistics than some U.S. companies if you start looking at the folks that are moving trucking and logistics going about? That's what we need to ride on because the U.S., any work done with MCC, or you'll say at least you're sure being payment, because that coming to the challenges is part of the problem in the continent. It's not a lack of money. That's absolutely not a challenge. You think you got a headache getting money? Go speak with money, people place money. They got bigger headache because they don't know where to go with the money. It's a project pipeline that's missing. It's really the ability for real projects to come to the table. So this is one of the things I think even within DFC is going to be interesting is how much of that sort of money is utilized for preparing projects, because that is the bottleneck. The other, political stability, mentioned the ups and the downs. It's very interesting. Where am I going after Thanksgiving? Angola. After I define West Africa as my neck of the woods, where do I go? I go to Angola. Where am I going from Angola? I'm going to Ethiopia. Why? Coincidental? Absolutely not. Exactly what Linda was saying. We had long years there. We built sugar factories there. Ironically, now they want to privatize them. Let's come on back. But these are countries we stayed out of the last 10, 12 years. Haven't even stepped into the countries. Why? Because it was unstable. It was nothing new. Government change, if it stays, we go forward. So I think that is a very important thing, because in the end, business just needs to have stability. And even if it's not good news, let me know what the bad news is ahead of time so I can mitigate on it. I always keep saying, I don't want to have the train hit me in the back. I want to see it. It gives me a little bit of a chance, maybe I'll avoid it. So let's keep that in mind for business side, that's going to bring it in. Scaling is another big issue, because business has to grow to be profitable, has to scale. And now you run into a whole bunch of, there are huge countries and there's a whole bunch of small countries. Very difficult to do any kind of a scaled up project in a Togo or a Benin, if you don't include a Nigeria or Ghana and a Cote d'Ivoire. So part of this, to me, before we even get to the continental one, is can we get it right in the regional ones? It's a nice photo op, the CFT, or but let's get ECOWAS, let's get, same thing, ECOWAS, PTA, SADC, let's get those working first, East Africa Union, and then we go build to the other one. But the need for scaling is absolutely, absolutely essential. And final thoughts on, sorry, I was writing this on the airplane last night. Recommendations, US engagements. The US FDC, and I know there's a lot of punch or a lot of sort of publicity. Well, here's the interviews and, particularly in the African media, of how do we cope with the Chinese US FDC. It's not the same thing. It really is not. But it is the potential of that. And what you're getting now is the buyers and the partners for US business of tomorrow, of today, never mind tomorrow, it's today, is no longer just the government. It is the African businesses that are growing and are scaling, that understand whole cycle value to product, understand that people come and stay. It's not just come in, build it, and go. Look at some of the infrastructure Chinese have put in. It's not, for one thing, I'm not a China basher. I think Greg mentioned it. They came in, they put in money, they're interested, they're engaged. So you know what? I'm not blaming Chinese. Do we need to engage? Absolutely. But most importantly, and there's somebody, I don't know if there are any African ambassadors of that side, is the African the African political leadership. It has to be engaged, because in the end, if you end up selling off minerals or whatnot to get you ports, and then you say, well, but we weren't trained, probably you told the Chinese, and this is the case, the port in Cameroon, I need the port by December, I think 2-3 years ago. Chinese work around the clock with their own workers. You could have said, to get the photo out by the end of the year. But guess what? You go down there, there's no road coming out of there. Port without a road, it's called like a lake with no road getting to it. So you could have said, my Chinese partners here, take your time, go the next 12 months, but train my people here. I want 20% to be local Cameroonian. In the meantime, I'll build the road, because that was the government componentry. So this is part of the thing. Let's quit blaming the Chinese. Let's go to the leadership, because that's that political leadership that's key both to their own business and eventually to any FDI that comes in, because we work with them. So I think for me, in closing, that's maybe one very important thing to really look at. And then the last piece is choose the beachhead. Just start somewhere and then work from there. You cannot look at 50 things, because, things look that come on the wire. There's this opportunity, that opportunity, it's ADB, whatnot. These are already pre-cooked if you haven't been there cooking in. So you either cook it yourself because you can be there, and I don't mean cooking under the table. I mean cooking by understanding what is the real demand and the need. Then you cook it with the partners. Then you go and you find your diaspora, you find your American mafia out there, and then and mafia in the good sense, the Fulbright scholars become ministers. And then you know what's happening, and you'll be surprised how business starts tipping in your direction. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Great, two excellent and complementary pieces. We'll open it up. I maybe want to start with a question, and Ambassador Cohen and I at the break were talking about governance versus democracy, where is the agenda there? I wanted to ask Linda, perhaps, where you see U.S. investment in democracy going. Do we need kind of new ways to engage on democracy and governance? And Mima, from you, also your perspective on what corruption, governance versus democracy, one of the big obstacles is that a small company has to do massive due diligence lest they get linked up, and caught up in FCPA, for example. And there's even been some talk about kind of pushback on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, saying it's just too much of a barrier when companies like China and others are not held to those standards. Personally, I would hate to see the FCPA eroded, but it is for smaller companies a difficult one.
First on the issue of how we engage with Africa on democracy and governance, I think we're at a point now where we just want to continue to engage. We have to do it differently. We have to be much more aware of the environment on the ground and how we are viewed on the ground. But my worry right now is that we're not engaging on those issues, and we're signaling to African countries that we don't care. And this is a double-edged sword. It's governments, heads of state, who are pretty happy with the lack of engagement on democracy and governance. And they're ready to throw back at us our own rhetoric.
Our own fragile democracy, in fact.
Yeah. And I was, was it last week or the week before when Nigerian soldiers shot into a crowd of people and said, well, we did it because the American president said if rocks are being thrown, then it's an act of violence and you can fire on them. So leaders are listening at whatever message fits their agenda. And it worries me that we're not giving them a much more direct message on these issues. Although I will say that I saw the statement that the State Department put out on Cameroon, and it was very, very strong. But again, I think we're sending mixed signals. So I'm hopeful, again, glass half full, that the new administration strategy on Africa will define what our priorities and focus will be on the issue of democracy and governance. I think, again, when I talk to civil society groups, they're missing us. They're wondering where we are and why we're not as vocal as we have been in the past. And on the other side of that ledger, heads of state and governments are thankful. Yeah.
Where you sit is where you stand.
Governance, democracy, and business are tied at the umbilical cord. Let's be clear, absolutely tied to the umbilical cord. Because no governance, that democracy maybe can still have different definitions of how we get there, but governance and business fully tied. And I mean, classic A, why am I going back to Angola and Ethiopia when I've been there 15 years? Simple answer, why? Now, I think it's important. It's actually a very interesting case with Madam when Linda was ambassador to Liberia, which was, big, especially early days, very, very crap problems. We went in, we agreed, I said, listen, many Liberian leaders are Americans also. I said, do you mind if I just invoke the no-fly? No fly, you will not get your visa. So before the bite comes, I'm speaking as a business person, may I tell you, my brother or sister, don't ask me, because the next thing is gonna happen is I have to report to the embassy, and you ain't gonna go visit your relatives. So leave it out. What happened, it took a year longer to get the PPA, not the PPA, but the actual concession. But we got it. So I say to American business partners or colleagues, you wear that on your sleeves. No under the table. We're gonna be partners, we're gonna work together in business. You, when Liberia's got the whole replication, you congressmen or whatever they're called, the legislators, you're gonna get jobs in your district. That's your benefit in the end, but you ain't gonna get a penny. It can be clear. And that does in the end work, but we had an interesting combination.
It takes time.
It took an extra year.
Yeah.
So that's why it's difficult for small companies. How can you spend a year? We had enough, financial backing to be able to do it. But it's absolutely clear that needs to be worn on the sleeve. Second, that then needs by media to be really publicized, because in the end, investment will go where there is governance. There's going to be results. And people will, as a result, go somewhere or not go somewhere else. You have that choice, and that needs to be seen. The real change is the change in the society within the various African countries with their own business leaders. Because you think it's hard to be faced with corruption as a foreign direct investor? Try to be faced with that as a local investor. You're really deep down then, because you got to, then it becomes a family, not this brother and sister, times 4. So I think this issue just has to be, it's actually our duty as foreign investors to insist on it, because it makes it easier on the African business leaders, but completely tied to umbilical cord.
That's very good to hear, both of you. I mean, I think, particularly as kind of the human rights, democracy agenda is very uncertain right now, I think it's important to make that very point very forcefully, and all the business folks out there to make that point and be strong advocates for it. Just as perhaps the security sector can also make that point. You need kind of the voices that are going to get traction with the administration to hammer that home. Yes, shall we take a couple at a time? So the man on the far aisle.
Jonathan Weaver, president of the Pan-African Collective. To the secretary, I was just curious, you mentioned the DRC and you mentioned Nigeria, so that the DRC in December for their election, Nigeria coming up in February. Would you make any comments about what's happening in Malawi in terms of the presidential situation there?
It's interesting, when I didn't say it, but when I listed the countries that I'm worried about backsliding, Malawi was on my list as well. If you've been watching the news, and clearly you have, Joyce Banda is running, and I think that's a positive sign that Joyce was able to go back and to be in a position where she can run. But I am worried as they go forward that their lead up to the election is one that is not violent, and that the kinds of attacks that we've seen, both verbal and physical, that those attacks end. And I think, we have to send some strong messages to President Mutharika that no less is expected from him, and that he has an obligation to ensure that they continue to move forward. But it's on my list of worry countries.
Okay, let's take a couple at a time. Well, go to, no problem. Mr. Mallet, and then in the back, and then over here.
Because I think there are some recommendations that will come from this forum. I am concerned about the description by the Ghanaian president that aid was a thing of the past. I do understand the trade versus aid conversation. I've always thought it was a little too binary and probably should not be juxtaposed, because aid supports economic development. And there are so many resource needs in this country, in many of these countries, both trade, aid, investment, all of that's necessary. What I did not hear, and it isn't because you don't have an opinion about it, both of you, I'm sure you do, and I'm really interested in hearing, the real curious thing here in talking about trade and aid and investment and democracy and governance is Rwanda. Yes. And what's happened in Rwanda compared to, of course, what's happening in Zimbabwe. And that trade versus aid issue is almost non-existent, because Rwanda was a darling of lots of aid organizations, and yet they remained on our bad list around democracy and governance. So I really would be interested in hearing your comments about that.
Well, it's wonderful that two persons on the platform or on the panel have strong connections with Liberia, where I'm from originally. And I want to ask...
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Isaac Vatukpajina, the CEO for Sustainable Development International. I want to ask Ambassador Greenfield, firstly, in terms of accountability on these African countries. We see a lot of investment going in, a lot of aid going in, but we don't see the impact of those dollars. And at the end of the day, there are some claims, some reports on the successes of some of these, like the Fed or whatever other program, but we don't feel the impact. So my question is, how can we move away from the assumption that 75% of your $8 return back to the United States as opposed to having an impact on the local situation in the country? And your comment about government being elected, good elections, but the governor or the president not being necessarily good, I felt it was directly related to the Liberian situation. So, so I'm wondering, what are those names that you would like to call with regards to not being good presidents? And to Mima, I want to say, thank you for your intervention from an investment perspective with BRE in Liberia. But BRE exit from Liberia left a very bitter taste. So I don't know what was the situation there. How can other people have some lessons learned from that in terms of, how investors come in, we have high expectations for them, and then we don't get the desired results, and how does that impact, other folks?
Good morning. My name is Rosa Molo, and I'm with the Bizel Group. We've talked about trade, we've talked about democracy, we've talked about a lot of stuff. We haven't talked about the workforce and how healthy they are. And so I'm looking at the health issues of the workforce. With all the new businesses coming in, are they relying on government systems, or are there opportunities for businesses in the United States that are health focused to come in and introduce a health model that the companies can do? Because I don't believe the companies should be running their health, but they could work with other businesses to run health systems and clinics to ensure a healthy workforce. And if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Vivian Lowry Derrick, the Bridges Institute, and thank you to the panelists for these presentations. I was going to follow up on Bob's question about Rwanda, but he asked it so well. But I'm also concerned about education and hopefully the primacy of education. 72% of primary school graduates in Africa do not go on to secondary school. And when we're talking about democracy, we're talking about business investment, you really need an educated labor force. And also, I think you need to think about the importance of education given the ISIS and security issues, et cetera. So I'm wondering how education can be integrated into both the social development aspects as well as MIMA's contributions in terms of trade and investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivian. You're singing my song, and I was so glad to hear Congresswoman Bass bring education up. I think maybe under a different administration that might have been a real opportunity to build a big initiative around. But let's take those. We have the trade versus aid, the puzzling, the tricky case of Rwanda on that, how to move from assistance to impact, and the healthy workforce, and then this education. You don't have to answer all of them, but.
Just to start with Bob's question on aid, I don't think the president of Ghana said he didn't want aid. I think his position was that aid can't be the only source of growth in an economy because it doesn't work. And so he wanted to prioritize investment as a way of creating jobs and creating prosperity. Certainly, I think countries that are in need of aid, who've not yet reached the point that Ghana has reached, ought to be looking at how they transition, but we know that they're dependent on aid. So my feeling is, the last thing I want to do is sit in a meeting and hear from a government, what kind of aid are you going to give us? What I want to hear is, how can you work with us to help us build a capacity so that we can move beyond aid And that might require some capacity building and support in various sector. The Rwanda case, always a difficult one. How do you address that? And yes, Rwanda was the darling. Why was Rwanda the darling? It was the darling because we missed the signal that was going on that led to the genocide. And so, like Israel is the darling of our foreign assistance, Rwanda, for a time, has been a darling. I think they're beginning to lose their luster from that standpoint, but that's what it's about. At the same time, Kagame has made a lot of progress, despite the undercurrent of the politics in the country and the lack of political space. We're seeing that he's made some progress. He has focused on things like education. He has focused on healthcare. So I think where we are with Rwanda is give them credit where credit is due, but also call them out on where we see issues, and we do see issues there. And I'll just touch on the Liberia question on accountability of our investment. It's the vein of every ambassador's existence. We want to see impact. Impact is an important part of our foreign assistance. And I hear figures that 72% of our foreign aid comes back to the United States. I have people saying 90%, but I also know that I've been on the ground and I've seen the amazing impact of some of the projects that we have completed in Africa. And I think one of the most important one is what we've done in the area of PEPFAR and the malaria initiative. The impact of those two initiatives can't be questioned in terms of what we've seen on the ground as far as that is concerned. And I think we can go across the board and look at impact. I do think we have to look at how we approach aid in the future. It clearly does not work over a long period of time, the approach that we've had. And so it definitely needs to evolve given what we're seeing on the ground. We're seeing better capacity in Africa. I work on refugee and humanitarian issues. It's been a part of my career, and I was at a meeting late last week at the American Refugee Committee, and all of their senior on-the-ground representatives were from Africa. And I mentioned to them that 30 years ago when I started this, none would have been from Africa. So that's an important, I think, important level of progress. Also on my comment that good elections don't always elect the best president, I was not referring to Liberia. I think we have some examples close at hand.
Rima.
I think we both seem to be focused on question 1 and 2, but I've got strong opinions, and I'll come back and make a comment on 3 and 4. But on the aid piece, I mean, they literally tracks exactly what I said about the sophistication of the business sector in the continent. The people, the development of the people and the mindset and the capacities have changed. So I think what USAID is trying to do, I forget what, ironically, Murray Green was my predecessor of mine as president of IGD. But, going on is that it's really to work yourself truly out of a job, which means building up the capacities in the countries. So as there are more and more and more truly educated and capable peoples nationally, this is where really you're going to have to start transferring it away from the U.S. expats going across. And that's the cost element. That makes it a lot less costly, more competitive, and you're actually doing more of the job. So I think that really is where I come in on that. Now, is the aid piece needed? Absolutely, but it's in the transition. So I think some of the more humanitarian, that maybe the education, health, and ends up in that arena. But anything that's in this growth sector, please, let's take my agro-industry sector. Consultants are consultants because they're experts in agro-industry versus getting a very good redneck farmer out there that's your partner. Let's get people that know the business out there doing what needs to be done and with the local partners. I think this is where the 8 piece is kind of changing. And, Franklin Moore was with us actually in Johannesburg. We did a panel on leadership for ag. And what this whole thing comes down to is not only what aid is coming, but how the African, I come back to the African policy, their own African political leaders, to recognize that agric is not a vocation, it's a business, it's agri-industry, that's the growth. And this growth across all the various sectors is going to come back and touch on the question of education and health, because it's very difficult to continue investing in education from outside. It's got to be domestically created resources, and domestically created resources come out of growth. And there's no other way out of it, and it is something the business needs. If we don't have educated people, who are you going to hire? Then you start bringing expats. Expats cost 3 times more. I'd rather hire somebody local, now go back to needing educated people. Health side, I've seen a lot of opportunities come, because every challenge, every problem actually is a business opportunity. And again, the business spin on it, I've seen a lot of just private hospitals come in. This is more for let's say the middle class. You have big urbanization coming on the continent, all right? The middle class, domestic, that now needs proper health care. The businesses, rather than having to ship and fly, think about every time you medevac somebody what it costs versus a clinic that can handle 90% of everything. So that is beginning at that sort of, yes, at the middle class, but once you have that level set up, adding additional functionality, additional ability to reach the poor is easier than if you have zero, or John F. Kennedy Hospital that most of them didn't have power. So let me switch to the accountability issue, because I think it's critical. So one last thing on the governance. There was a survey, I don't know if it was Ned, I forgot who funded it, back a few years ago. I should have copied it, because I keep constantly quoting it. It was a worldwide survey of families, of parents, asking what is more important for you today? A truly transparent election, or that your family lives better tomorrow? And I hate to tell you, but more than 50% went for the latter. So I think this is partially what the answer to the Rwanda question is. But leave aside the elections, from the standpoint of talking to Rwandese, what have I gotten? What have I gotten? You got the one country that goes from disaster to this. I was chuckling, coming out of about a month ago to the airport. Just going through, it was such a pleasant thing at the end of it. I said, "Excuse me, can I do it one more time, just so I can remember before I arrive in Conakry? Just let me just go one more time through." So it's a small example, but accountability that's why I said, to me, it's governance. Yes, we need elections, and each time election would be a little bit better, but more important is governance. And that's, I think, the sort of point I wanted to leave behind. On BRE, just to answer on that, sorry, BRE is Buchanan Renewables Energy. It really ties right back into the issue I was saying earlier of the relationship. My back broke down, I ended up with 6 levels of back fusion, went out. Unfortunately, Schaefer sold interest, and the people that are getting in who and what just did not know how to continue the relationship and build on it. And part of how I ended up at IGD, ironically, Rob Mosbacher was OPIC president that financed that. The company ended up repaying the loan, actually, so there was financially was fine. My mea culpa going out is I ended up having to be CEO getting to be CEO of IGD. So it's really relationships. That's the critical part, I think, in the end. Thank you.
Let me just make one more comment on the education point that Vivian made, because I think that's an important point that we cannot ignore. Because education is at the core of preparing young people for the future. In my role at Albright Stonebridge Group, and we meet and advise companies that are interested in doing business in Africa, one of the first questions they ask is the capacity, the human resource capacity levels in the country. Can people read and write? Can they speak good English? Can we hire not engineers? They do want engineers, but usually they can get those. They want to know if they can hire secretaries and bookkeepers, and a char force that is trained. They want to know that the capacity is there, and you need a basic education level to do any type of job anywhere in the world now. And so if I had a magic wand, and I remember Secretary Kerry asking me this when I came on as Assistant Secretary, if I could focus on one thing, that would be the education system. If we could pour as much as we possibly can into building strong basic education systems. You know, forget the universities, because universities are just pouring out people who can't get jobs and who are not qualified because they didn't have a good basic education level to come in. So it's primary school and secondary school. And with that level of education, most people are ready for a job. And then you can look at the universities.
Amen.
Can I add to the university just real quick? No, because business needs all, there's no question. But the universities, somebody asked about the HBCUs earlier. HBCUs, land-grant colleges, and getting, we have something in the U.S., and I look at this as an important American, the relationship between business and academia is so strong and leveraged. I mean, I'm talking just a simple example, land-grant colleges and doing extensions. Introducing that thing as part of it, that's how you're going to get higher education, because business will pay for it in the end, because it winds up being cheap mental power. Thank you.
Nancy Onyango from the IMF. I don't have an answer to the points that were made about the IMF, sorry, because I'm from the audit side. But I just wanted to ask the two panelists whether for any of these policies and the things that you've talked about, education, health, governance, is there a gender lens to this? Because I think Africa is on the continent of Africa, I think women are so disadvantaged. They just don't even hit the radar in many aspects. But I think that would be something that would help turn quite a lot of what you're talking about. And I just wonder to what extent you've got policies that are geared in that direction.
Great, thank you. If you could pass the mic down to Ambassador Cohen.
Well, two things. I just want to mention a great new business opportunity in Africa where the U.S. is now in the lead. This, because I think Greg mentioned 350 million middle-class Africans. Well, they want housing. And U.S. companies now that I advise are building $40,000 houses. And these civil servants and army officers and others are taking out mortgages. And the U.S. companies now are in the lead, and it's spreading all over Africa now. Okay, I have a question for Mima. On the question of developing industrial agriculture, what about land tenure? Have the Africans mastered that issue yet?
Let me just respond on the gender issue. There's absolutely a gender lens in our approach to education in all sectors on the continent of Africa. I think Hillary Clinton said it best when she said, if you educate a woman, you educate a country, you educate a village. That's not an exact quote, but it went to the importance of educating women who would educate their children. You find that women who are educated have fewer children. Women who are educated take care of the health care of their children and their families. So there's absolutely a gender lens there. There's also a gender lens on our policies for promoting entrepreneurship. Because again, we found when I was working in Afghanistan that when we gave loans to Afghan women, they paid back their loans at a much faster rate and a much more consistent rate than men we loan money to. So again, small and medium-sized businesses run by women, many of them tend to be very successful because of the commitment that women make. So there's an effort to invest in that area.
Okay, just a quick comment on the gender lens. I mean, there's two organizations that are very closely involved, MCC and the African Development Bank, and both of them very, very strong lenses. I mean, MCC is right in the scorecard, educating girls. And the health issue, same thing. ADB, we come in with Akin Adesh, the president now. Agripreneurs, youth entrepreneurs, all of it skewed very much with the gender lens. So I think in the banking, everything that's done. The lens is there. The question is delivering on the lens. Hank, on for agri-industry. The housing, I'm glad you brought up, sorry, I skipped it. That is a very important, because we are very good at it. The issue becomes really the financing, and understanding mortgage finance and the underwriting, the backing with the sovereignty. And that's one of the things, actually, I've come to the group board of the Vista Bank, introduce the American banking in Africa, because you have Citibank, but Citibank is basically going with the big clients. We want to bring in American banks that do SME lending, and construction lending is where it always ends up. It's very critical for growth. The agri-industry, the single largest obstacle is land tenure. There's no question about it. And we have now in the continent hundreds of different variations of land tenure. So I'm not even going to go into the detail. We spent a whole day with that. What is critical to understand, though, and this is sometimes, now I'm sort of been out of the nonprofit community, but certain elements of nonprofit community are getting it totally wrong with the fear of land grab. The land grab issue can be handled again by the policymakers, political leadership. When you start giving out, when somebody starts asking for 100,000 hectares of land, I guarantee that person has no freaking idea what 100,000 hectares means. And how are you going to move land? All they're doing is they want to have land on it and go flip it. So that can be easily stopped. Now, on the smaller scale, who is really getting hit even worse than the foreign investor? The smallest holder. It's the only thing they got is title. If I want to go and get any kind of a loan, you come to Vista Bank, that's the only thing I might have, and I don't have that. So that's something that the political leadership needs to understand in the country is you're hurting not just FDI, you're hurting the smallest. So let's make sure we try to how do we get there? We can spend a whole day discussing it, but it's the obstacle, major obstacle.
Listen, thank you both for really a lively exchange and great points made. We are going to move seamlessly, I believe, to our next panel, but please join me in thanking Ambassador Greenfield.